Good evening, everybody. I'm Dartricia Rollins, the Assistant Director of Charis Circle, the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books and More, the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore, who just celebrated 47 years last week. And I'm so glad that you're here with us tonight. Tonight's event is co-hosted by Susan Kidd, Director of the Agnes Scott College Center for Sustainability. Susan became the first ever Director of Sustainability at Agnes Scott College in January 2008. She's a two-time graduate of ASC. She earned a bachelor's degree in history in 1978 and a master's degree in teaching secondary English in 2007. The Center for Sustainability is where the Agnes Scott community learns about the challenges of global climate change, including climate and environmental justice. Their mission is to seek collaborations on innovative and equitable solutions for sustainability on and off campus. Susan will now introduce tonight's guest. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction. I appreciate it on behalf of Agnes Scott College and myself. So it's really wonderful to be here with everyone that's joined us. Welcome, welcome, welcome. As Dartricia said, I'm Susan Kidd, and I'm at Agnes Scott College, and I am literally at Agnes Scott College this evening. We're in Decatur, along with Charis, our campus bookstore that's right across the street from us, which is just outside of Atlanta, for those of you that might be joining us from farther away. And it's really such a pleasure for me to welcome you all, both for Charis and for Agnes Scott. So Agnes Scott is a liberal arts college in Decatur. We've been around since the 1890s, but always challenging ourselves to be up to date, to educate young women, and especially on the challenging issues of our times. And we are a college that right now says climate change is, if not the one of the top few most challenging issues of our time. So this book tonight is rings very true for those of us at Agnes Scott that are working on climate change. My office, as Dartricia said, focuses on the climate work of the college, and we're reducing our own carbon footprint. And we've reduced our footprint by about 40%, which we're very proud of. We're on target for 100% reduction by 2037. And I know if your newsfeed reads your mind like mine does, I guess that's what they're supposed to do. I am inundated right now with the UN Conference of Parties in Glasgow, Scotland, the UN COP 26. And I was reflecting today on the fact that I think talking about this book with these two amazing speakers tonight is so uplifting for us in the middle of watching the difficulty of negotiating on the national and global scales with negotiators, observers, etc. And this sort of, I feel like tonight brings us back to the reality of individuals and voices and the work that goes on, no matter what all the fanfare is. And I believe in the fanfare. We need the top level commitments, and we need the long-term goals, but it's what gets done on the ground, whether it's at a small college or in the countries that our author has visited on the ground, that's so critical. So I'm really grateful to Charis for bringing this book, these two speakers to our attention, and for connecting the Center for Sustainability. And a quick word on Charis. Charis is a bookstore, and they are in fact our bookstore, as I mentioned, but there's so much more. I mean, I would really describe Charis as a community service that is available as a space, available as a learning center, and brings us these incredible offerings, both in person and now remotely, that have enhanced the community of Decatur and our college. They had an amazing, you picked up your books on their porch during the height of COVID. So they had a constant ordering, and you would, run into people on the porch or heading to the porch. And a lot of us are still picking up on the porch just because it is a fun community experience to do that. But then of course the store is back open and open for you to purchase tonight's book as soon as during or after this event. I'm very much in the midst of this amazing book myself, and it's really been an incredible, again, as I said, incredible week to read about the reality of the work on climate. So So please consider supporting Charis. You saw that notice when you signed on, and you'll have another opportunity. And then, of course, buy this book and other books from them. And what a book this is. 1001 Voices for Climate Change. What a great title and what a great book. And I think my reflection on it is that it teaches us, our author, teach us to listen better, teaches us to value every voice. And at the same time, it teaches us a lot that we may not know about climate change. So we're going to places we've probably never been to. A lot of Americans have never been to with this book. We're meeting people we certainly haven't met, we might not ever meet, and really understanding what climate change means, from technology to science to people. So very grateful for that. So my last order of business is to introduce, and I told our speakers I'm introducing them in a painfully short way, but we want to get on with the show, and they are the rest of the evening's show. So I'll introduce first the person that is in conversation with our author. So Jenée Desmond Harris. Jenée is an editor at Slate magazine, where she writes the Dear Prudence advice column. My newsfeed has now that's going to be popping up. She was previously a staff editor in the opinion section of the New York Times, where she is now a contributing writer. She's a graduate of Howard University and the Harvard Law School and lives in the Bay Area. Thank you, Jenée, for being here across country with us.
Thank you.
And our author is Devi Lockwood. And she has written about science, climate change, and technology for also the New York Times, The Guardian, Slate, and The Washington Post, among other publications. She spent 5 years traveling in 20 countries on 6 continents to document these 1001 stories, or these ongoing 1001 stories on water and climate change. So I'm going to turn it over to you, where you will explain this work in more detail. Thank you both.
Yeah. Awesome. Yay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for having me. I think, should I talk a little bit about, kind of give a brief introduction to the work first, and then we can jump into questions? Okay. So this book, 1001 Voices on Climate Change, is the culmination of 5 years of interviews that I did in 20 countries on every inhabited continent. And the inspiration for that trip came from a bike trip that I did in between my junior and senior years of college. I rode the bike about 800 miles down the Mississippi River, starting in Memphis, Tennessee, and ending in Venice, Louisiana, where the river meets the Gulf of Mexico. And along the way, I listened to stories of any kind that people had to share with me. And the farther down the river I was riding my bicycle, the more stories I was hearing about water and climate change, specifically to do with things like saltwater encroachment on the land, intensifying storms that meant that people had to, in many cases, leave places that they'd called home for generations, or make tough decisions about how much risk they might tolerate about the next storm. And this passage that I want to read it's just super brief. It's from the introduction. It's about kind of the idea of deep listening, and how that informed how I thought about what we need in order to broaden the conversation about climate change moving forward. Throughout the journey, I developed a method of deep listening. This was hard-earned and not instinctual. When I listened to early clips of my journey down the Mississippi, I cringed. I was too pushy. I spoke over storytellers, eager to insert myself. I listened only halfway, the other half of my mind on how I would respond or redirect the conversation next. I'm an auditory person. When I meet someone, the first thing I notice is the musicality of their voice, how they let the taste of a word linger on their tongue or send sentences flying into the ether. Breath, intonation, word choice. Sometimes my favorite thing to do is close my eyes and listen. In Margaret Wheatley's 2001 article, Listening is Healing, written a few days after 9/11, she wrote, "Great healing is available when we listen to each other. No matter what we have experienced in life, if we can tell our story to someone who listens, we find it easier to deal with our circumstances. Listening is such a simple act. It requires us to be present, and that takes practice, but we don't have to do anything else. We don't have to advise or coach or sound wise, she continued. We just have to be willing to sit there and listen, and if we do that, we create moments in which real healing is available. When I'm listening, microphone in hand, nodding along and not breaking eye contact, there have been so many times when people have said, thank you for listening, or it feels so good to share this story with you. I've never shared it with anyone else before. In listening, I want to be sure that people feel respected and heard. I met a Belgian woman in the UK who told me the story of how her hometown's water supply was contaminated from a plant that put a waterproof treatment on fabric. A man from Afghanistan lost his brother because of water contamination. An American woman visited the Florida Keys as a teenager, only to return years later to find that the reef was dead, bleached. Thank you for listening, each of these storytellers told me at the end, often through tears. I enjoy listening also to people whose perspectives and takes on the world are different from my own. There's a difference between offering stories and opinion and offering something aggressive or vitriolic. The first comes from the desire to share and connect. The second is purely an attack. One carries the potential for change and exchange. The other does not. Deep listening has to start from the basic premise that we are all equal, all worthy of being listened to, all human, that everyone has a story to share, that those stories matter, and that we can learn from each other if only we are fully present. Deep listening is listening without the intention to respond, listening with the whole of one's body, making eye contact, leaning forward, nodding along without interrupting. Deep listening is honoring, is bearing witness, is keeping one's ears and mind open without the distraction of ego or fear. This kind of listening is urgently needed in the climate crisis because listening is the first stop on the way to solution building. If we're building solutions that don't take into account the voices of people who will be impacted, it's dangerous and, more importantly, ineffective. So that's a brief intro into what this book's about.
That's a great intro to an amazing book. As we got started planning for this conversation, I was thinking back to how we first met. So I was a staff editor in the New York Times opinion section, and you were on a one-year fellowship there. And I remember you reached out and asked me to get coffee, as all good new employees would do, to get to know their colleagues. I hadn't read anything about you yet. So right before I left for the cafeteria, I kind of frantically looked up your website and tried to figure out who you were. I thought you'd probably be like a recent Ivy League grad who had some fancy internships in media, like most people who end up at the Times. And I was shocked when I learned that you were so much more than that. And it hit me that you weren't just an ambitious journalist, but you were a person who was ambitious about making the world better, and journalism was simply your medium at that moment. I remember throughout our time together at the Times, you were such a hard worker. You would be emailing all hours of the day and night. You were editing so many more pieces than even people who work there full time, doing a lot of hands-on work to uplift the voices of people who hadn't been on our pages before. And I actually got worried about you. And I remember telling you, like, work less, you need to take some time off. And after reading this book, I feel so stupid for being worried about you. Because here I was thinking you were wearing yourself out working from your laptop in New York when you've biked all over the world, taken cargo ships, hitched rides on sailboats, spent months not knowing where your next meal was going to come from, where you were going to sleep. So my apologies for not realizing how tough you were.
Oh my God.
Speaking of your work at the Times, that brings me to my first question, which is that I saw a lot of parallels between the work you did in opinion, trying to give voice to the stories of people who had not told them before, to make their arguments, even getting on the phone with them and helping them kind of tease out their arguments to fit the format, and the work you did in this book. You had mentioned that after the Boston Marathon bombing, your first instinct was to go out on the street and collect stories. And I just wonder, what is it in your background, your education, or the way you were raised that made you someone who wanted to do that for other people, whose first instinct was to let other people tell their stories?
Oh my God. Well, that's so kind. Thank you. I think, I don't know, a lot of it has to do with my undergrad. education in folklore and mythology. It was an incredible program, super tiny. I think there were 8 of us in my year, which was an unusually large year. And so we had these discussion-based classes where we practiced listening really closely to each other. And that was something that was also like reinforced in my high school education, where it was kind of discussion-based learning, a lot of just sitting around the table and figuring out, I don't know, I was like a pretty shy kid. So I feel like I found some of my voice and then got a bit better at, speaking first and then eventually listening, although it took actually doing the audio recordings and listening back to myself to realize that I wasn't that good at it at first. I just needed to work harder and get better. But yeah, we would have all sorts of assignments to go out into the Boston area, into the community beyond Harvard, which is where I was a student, and to really listen to people. And that I think taught me that, sometimes there's more interesting conversations happening outside of academia or the places where we think the interesting conversations are happening than is what's happening inside. And that, both communities are better when they're in conversation with each other. And so I tried to really carry that ethic forward with me of, thinking closely about narrative and who has the power to tell stories and why, and then always asking questions of that and asking, okay, who's not in the room, who should be in the room, and who is most impacted by whatever kinds of conversations were happening. How can we bring their voices in and like uplift? So that, yeah, I think that's a bit where it came from.
So when it comes to the stories you collected for the book, I know there are obviously 1001, so you won't be able to give all the highlights, but what are a few of them that were particularly impactful for you or that you've heard readers bring up and say that really stuck with them?
Yeah, so I'm going to go to the equator and then I'm going to go north of the Arctic Circle, if you'll bear with me for a moment. So I spent about a month end of 2014 in Tuvalu, which is this coral atoll nation, often cited as one of the places that's most vulnerable to climate change because it's so low lying. The highest point is about 14 feet above sea level and population of around 10,000. Since the Australian government has been monitoring the level of the ocean in the early 90s, there's been about 4 millimeters of sea level rise per year. And so 4 millimeters doesn't sound like that much, but it has really dramatic impacts in the ways that people are able to access food and water on the islands. So speaking of water, there used to be wells that people could kind of dig a shallow well in the ground, have access to fresh water in the form of a freshwater lens that floated above the denser salt water for everything, washing, bathing, cooking. And in the last 20, 25 years now, that water has become salty and contaminated largely from that sea level rise. And the first thing that people noticed when something was wrong was that in the outer islands, they would dig these kind of shallow pits to grow taro and pulako, which are staples of Tuvaluan cuisine, these kind of starchy root vegetables. And in the early 2000s, they started to rot and the islanders didn't know why. And after a period of investigation, they found that it was because that groundwater was salty. So it's the changes that people feel are so there's so many. I mean, there used to be thatched roofs and now people have these tin roofs that are connected to a rainwater tank. Rain is precious because all of the water for washing, bathing, drinking, every use comes from the rain. And when the rain doesn't fall in a regular way, it puts a lot of pressure on people, on families about how to allocate it. Specifically, I met a woman named Angelina, who's my age. When we spoke, she was in her early 20s. She has a couple kids. There had been a big drought a couple years before. And each house was allocated from a desalination plant, kind of one big bucket in the morning and one at night, but it wasn't enough. And so she was telling me that, she and her husband and her older kids could go into the lagoon and wash themselves and their clothes in the salt water, more or less. But her youngest daughter, the newborn, would get this terrible rash. And so it becomes this kind of tension in people's lives and impacts the way that they think about their future as well. And similarly, just to fly for a moment to a completely different part of the globe, but a few years later, I was in the Canadian Arctic in a community called Igloolik in Nunavut. So it's a community of about 3,000 people. Hunting is the traditional way of accessing food. And I met a woman named Marie Iru, who was in her mid-70s. And she told me about going out on the land, which is kind of the word for going to find food, specifically for caribou and walrus, and that she and her husband in the 1980s would follow the migrational patterns of these animals and have enough food for their family and for their community. And she's noticed that because the water is warmer and the patterns of the ice are different, that she or her sons will have to go farther and farther away from Igloolik in order to access this same food that used to be much closer. And so it's just another example of how climate change is impacting both food and water security for people all around the world.
So when you were reporting for this book, you carried a sign, which you translated into different languages on a piece of cardboard that said, on one side, tell me a story about climate change, and on the other side, tell me a story about water. When did it occur to you that tell me a story about water would get you more of the rich responses that you were interested in? And how are the two connected?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I think that there's been an interesting change over the course of the 5+ years that I've been doing this project. But people were really hesitant to talk about climate change when I got started in 2013, 2014. Even on that first bike trip down the Mississippi River, right? People were experiencing the impacts of climate change and telling me about intensified hurricanes and floods and things like that. But they weren't using the language of climate change or necessarily linking those experiences to a larger global phenomenon. But the thing about water is that everyone has a story about water. And those can be really personal. It can be stories about learning how to swim or a near drowning experience, or I don't know, even just a personal connection, how being around a body of water makes someone feel. I think a lot of people draw a deep sense of connectivity to places that they've lived through the bodies of water specifically. And so I used to joke to myself that the water side was the really social side of the cardboard sign, because so many more people would come up to me. And whereas if I was, just walking around, it might be harder to get people to engage on climate change. But, that wasn't the case at, a climate march, or if I was wandering the halls of a, climate science institution of some kind. So it varied. But I think the other thing about climate change is that often the language that we use to discuss it can be really abstract and inaccessible, right? It's hard to connect our everyday lived experiences to something like parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or even feet of sea level rise, right? And part of what I was trying to do in this book, and also in asking people questions about water, was just to make it a bit more tangible, a bit more experienced. And not all of the impacts of climate change are experienced through water, but many of them are, whether that's a lack of water or an overabundance of it, or changes in rainfall patterns that change where people are able to grow food and survive. And so that was something I tried to hold close in approaching this material and trying to make it just a bit more accessible.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that a couple of people told you they didn't believe in climate change, yet they had stories about water. Oh, yeah. I remember one person saying, well, climate change isn't real. It just used to rain more than it does now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting. I think part of that's just because the climate language had become so politicized too, or frankly, that some people can be really put off by descriptions of climate change that rely really heavily on the science. If they don't have the background in the science education or the confidence in these subjects to be able to understand them, it can feel off-putting.
Right. During your travels, and I thought it was so interesting as a side note that you just stayed with so many different people. Yeah. You were essentially homeless for a lot of this time, and it just came together that you found a place to sleep every night, sometimes for weeks at a time.
People were really nice.
Yeah, you were a good guest. And at one home, you offered to help wash the dishes. And the response you received was, no, white people don't know how to wash dishes without using too much water. You got off dish duty for that night, but it made me wonder, what else did you learn about your consumption habits or American consumption habits as they compared to other people's around the world?
For sure. Yeah. So that the backstory to that being not able to wash the dishes because I'm white was in Tuvalu. I, just try to be a gracious guest and offer to help out with anything around the house. And I think I didn't realize that the precarity of the water situation, even when it's not a drought, it's just there's a certain amount of water in the rainwater tank. And like, I wanted to wash my clothes at one point during that month. And the family I was staying with was like, we have to wait until it rains. Like that's not important right now. But yeah, in terms of consumption, I mean, I met some really incredible climate activists in New Zealand specifically who challenged me to think about the impacts in terms of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere of all of the flying that I had been doing up until that point. And I was kind of affronted by it at first. I was like, wait, what? But sure enough, I went back home or went, onto my laptop, which I guess was home by default at that point at night, and looked at one of these, World Wildlife Foundation environmental footprint calculators or something like that. And the impact of flying far outweighed anything else that I could have done, whether that was traveling by bike or, not eating meat or whatever. And so I took that as a creative challenge to see how long I could last without flying, and crowdfunded the money to take a cargo ship across the Tasman Sea to Australia, and then spent 6 months cycling up the east coast of Australia, and then started hitching a ride on a sailboat that was supposed to take me to Indonesia. It didn't work out. I ended up back in Australia, like another sailboat and cargo ship later. It was pretty chaotic. And then it had been about a year at that point, and asking for more rides on sailboats was not working out. So I gave up and bought a cheap flight to Bangkok. But I don't know. I think that the impact of all of this has been, I think, very critically now about the idea that this is somehow my fault or your fault or any individual's fault, right? It's a systemic problem that has systemic solutions. And, having done even more research about the idea of what a carbon footprint is at this point, it's actually a concept that was created by the fossil fuel industry to distract us from what they're doing and get us to think that it's in fact, an individual responsibility. And so I'm a lot more skeptical now of trying to take on that burden as an individual or encouraging anyone else to do so, because I think that that's a fast track to despair and a distraction from getting us to work together to address the problems that really matter, which all get to the root of the fossil fuel industry globally. So yeah, it's been a bit of a circular journey in that way, but I'm really grateful that I was challenged in the way that I was challenged at different places, because it got me to not only be documenting stories from other people, but to take a look at myself and the impact of what I was doing while on this trip.
I mean, you really did make a heroic effort with the cargo ship and the seasickness you experienced. I'm so not sure how you got hired as a random person to help work on the sailboat and do night duty, but I'm glad it worked out.
It was really fun.
I liked how you admitted that, when did avoiding flight stop? It stopped when you ran up against the wall and you had to give up and just keep going. And that felt very realistic, that you did everything you could and then you had to continue to live life and realize the issues were bigger than just your choices.
Totally. Yeah, it was a good learning experience to try to do it for as long as I could, and then to be like, okay, wait, what are the limits of this?
Right. Aside note, I'm curious, what did you carry with you most of the time? A couple of times you mentioned having like a loaf of bread in your bag.
Oh yeah, big fan of bread.
Did you have? What were your supplies for this whole journey?
Like in terms of food or just in general?
Just like in your backpack.
Okay, so I have like a notoriously like sensitive back, so I didn't carry anything on my back, but there's these things called panniers which attach to like the front and rear rack of the bicycle. So I put all my stuff in there. A couple bottles of water on the bicycle itself. In the handlebar bag, I would have, phone, map, emergency snacks. In the back, I had a couple changes of clothes. I had a tent, sleeping bag, little sleeping mat. my laptop, journals, which I would like scribble all in and then send home. One of my favorite things about riding a bike by myself is I could just stop and write whenever I wanted to. That was really great because something about the active movement like got things flowing in my brain that I've been thinking about from a previous interview. The only thing I'm evangelical about in this world is menstrual cups. So I had one of those and it's so great for travel. And yeah, I mean, food was kind of a grab bag, but tried to eat as many vegetables as I could, as much as I could, or get my hands on things that felt familiar. But a lot of times it was just, surrendering to whatever was available at any given moment. So
I noticed many times when you asked someone if you could camp on their property, they would say, "Oh, come have dinner with us.
Please come by." Yeah.
So that worked out a lot.
I mean, people were so nice. Because my first bike trip was on, in the South, I thought it was a Southern hospitality thing, which it was. But then I traveled, to other places and realized it was just a worldwide thing. Like people were so kind and generous and eager to help. And there's also this website called Warm Showers, which is kind of like couch surfing, but for people who ride their bikes. And so I found a lot of hosts, especially in urban areas that way. But in more rural areas, I mean, I needed a certain amount of water to be able to even camp somewhere for the night. So I would go up to someone who was watering their plants in the, late evening golden hour and ask if I could fill up on water. And then they'd ask me where I would stay. And then, next thing I know, sleeping in like a race car bed that belongs to an 11-year-old who's out of town. And like, it's the coolest thing in the world. But I think a lot of that, I talked to some solo male cyclists who I met on the road and was like, "Oh, don't you get taken in all the time?" And they're like, "What? No, like no one even talks to me." And then I realized like, oh, okay, this is a gender thing and probably like a race thing and an age thing. And like, I'm not that tall, like I'm 5'5". I don't think anyone considers me intimidating.
Yeah.
So people were really eager to help. And I'm super grateful for that because, while I'm not a swashbuckling male travel writer who is going to the pub to like collect stories from the locals while getting completely drunk, like I didn't have access to that space because I didn't feel safe there, but I did have access to like people's kitchen tables. And there's an incredible kind of storytelling that's possible when people are open in that way. So yeah, really, really grateful for the randomness of that.
So let's talk a little bit about the generational differences that you observed.
Yeah.
So when you were in Tuvalu, you talked about the differences between the young and older people there. And you said the younger people wanted to take advantage of the opportunities they had to leave and go live somewhere else while their home was slowly being destroyed and made inhabitable by climate change. And then later in the book, I think it was in New Zealand, an adult you interviewed relayed a conversation in which a young person noticed that water levels were going down in the dam and said, "Oh, no problem, we could just use bottled water," and use tap water and didn't really see the connection. So that was kind of a generational difference in the opposite direction. This person said young people just don't get it. How did you see that play out across the world? And do you see any parallels in the United States?
Yeah. I mean, I think migration was a huge theme, just worldwide. Everywhere I went, there were examples of how climate change was intensifying migration or giving people reasons to leave a place that they've called home. In the Tuvalu example, so Angie, who's the mom who I had interviewed, she and her husband have applied repeatedly for this thing called the Pacific Access Category Visa. So it's a lottery that Tuvalu and the people from other low-lying island nations in the Pacific can apply to, whereby it becomes relatively easy to move to New Zealand. And there's a huge expat community of Tuvaluans living in and around Auckland as a result. And it brings up these big questions about, can home be moved from one country to another, and what happens when a place is, threatened. And, the elders in Tuvalu told me that they see climate change as an act of God, and that the bones of their ancestors are buried in the front yard. And that's something they couldn't bring with them if they left, and a reason why they were unwilling to leave this place they called home. In Thailand, I met a guy named Soon, who was a modern dancer in Bangkok, but he told me that his whole family for generations has been rice farming in the rural north, but the rainfall patterns have become so recently unpredictable that form of livelihood is just way more volatile than it was in the past. And so he came to the city in search of work because he couldn't do what his family had done for generations. And I mean, here in the US, I think we're seeing it already with multiple things. Migration from the outside. I think a lot of the intersecting crises in Central America are intensified by things like changes in rainfall patterns, or just things that make subsistence farming or other forms of livelihood more difficult. And that is a driver of conflict, which will promote or kind of prompt people to leave. So it has to do with what we're experiencing on the southern border here. But also, I don't know, wildfires out west, right? Yeah. I'm in Vermont right now. I've spoken with a handful of people who have, described themselves as, internally displaced climate refugees here in the US because they don't feel that they have a future in a place that's fire prone anymore. And so it's really everywhere in different ways. And it comes down to, who has access to be able to move. And that's a form of privilege that maybe we don't always talk about, but should be.
Tell me a little bit about the work you're currently doing at Rest of World as an editor there, and how it ties into all the different issues we're talking about right now.
Yeah, sure. So I am the ideas editor for a nonprofit newsroom called Rest of World, and we started in 2020. Our mission is to kind of diversify the conversation about climate change, about technology, and the business of technology, kind of culture and technology, and bring in more international voices specifically. So we don't focus on any stories that are located in US, Canada, Western Europe, New Zealand, or Australia, but everywhere else is fair game. So kind of taking the focus away from the West, where the majority of technology storytelling is focused, and trying to bring in more depth and nuance to the understanding of how technology operates in other places around the world. So as the ideas editor, it's a little bit similar to what I was doing when we were colleagues in opinion. So trying to bring in voices that would not otherwise be commenting on these issues to write argument-driven essays for us. About everything from feminist clubhouse rooms in Zimbabwe that are connecting the Zimbabwean diaspora to, the downstream impacts of all these various different big tech companies in places as diverse as Chile to Pakistan. So it's a really fun role, and love being able to work, especially with newer writers, to bring their ideas into the section, and also, people who have firsthand experiences. One of our more popular stories in this section in the past year was from a writer named Arnel Murga, who worked in a kind of business processing, outsourcing, a call center basically for people calling for help from the US in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. And he talked about the everyday racism that he experienced on that phone line, just because of the way that his voice sounded on the phone, or the hostility that came at him, what that felt like to deal with. So it's, not only for people who are interested in the culture and the markets in terms of technology, but also just the lived experience of what it's like to work in these industries.
Have you kept in touch with many of your subjects from the book? And two-part question. If so, have you ever used them for sources or ideas for writers from the parts of the world where they live?
Yes. Not so much at Rest of World, but at the Times for sure. There's this one incredible freshwater ecologist in New Zealand named Mike Joy, who I interviewed for the book. And he wrote an op-ed for the Times about the dairy industry, and specifically the impacts that intensified dairying have on the water quality in New Zealand in general, and the lowland rivers. People don't generally think about New Zealand as having super polluted rivers, but they do, especially surrounded by dairy farms. So that was one person. Angelina, again, not to talk about Angie and Tuvalu all the time, but we do chat on Facebook. Speaking of international technology, super popular platform there. She messages me every couple months to check in, and asked me if I've gotten married and settled down. And
about your dating life.
Like, I think she's trying to introduce me to someone sometimes, but it's really funny. We chat about, hopefully I would love to go back at some point in the future. It'd be really interesting to kind of re-interview some of the same people. But yeah, I would say there's folks from probably almost every community I've been to that have been able to stay in touch with longitudinally. It's just really interesting to see the way that our lives have, intertwined and then changed and gone off in different directions too. So
have you been able to get many of them copies of the book? And when you have, what's their reaction been?
Working on it. There was one woman in Australia who I had interviewed her husband and her son, and her husband has passed away in the time since, which is super sad. But she sent me a photo of the book open to that page on her legs, like reading on her porch, and that was super beautiful. So yeah, the feedback's been really positive. But one of my main goals for next year, now that book tour stuff is starting to wind down a little bit, is to send out these extra copies that I have to make sure that it gets to people who might not have access to it otherwise.
So I've been wondering, if someone came up to you with a sign that said, "Tell me a story about climate change," and you had to speak about the impact on your own life, do you have an idea of what story you would tell?
It's so funny that you asked that, because, I was wearing this sign for 5 years, and only once did someone ask me that same question, and it was this 5-year-old in New Orleans who's lovely. But the story that I told her, and the one that feels most central, I guess, to my experience here in New England, has to do with when I was a kid, we didn't worry about ticks or Lyme disease at all. I'm not that old, I'm 29. But we'd like romp around in the leaves in the fall, and it wasn't that big of a deal. And now everyone's just super freaked out about being outside for any period of time at all. You come inside and like immediately strip down and check yourself for ticks, because it's a miserable disease to have. Everyone in my family has got it at this point, because we just spend a ton of time outside. Unfortunately, it's like treatable with doxycycline, but part of the reason why there's such a problem with ticks in the Northeast has to do with climate change and the fact that our winters are shorter and warmer than they used to be, and wetter in some cases. And all of those things combine to make the breeding season for ticks longer. There's times when you go out in the snow and you can even get a tick. And so it's, I don't know, just something that I like, makes me very sad and gives me that kind of deep sense of solastalgia, like longing for the landscape that once was. But whenever I think about climate impacts at home, that's what first comes to mind.
Yeah, it's not like survival level, but it impacts your ability to enjoy the outdoors, which is
for
huge
sure.
Where you live. Yeah. I'll ask one more question before we open it to the audience.
Yeah.
So in the work you did as an op-ed editor, you often made a direct, measurable impact. In one piece you edited, you were able to stop a man from being deported back to Jamaica, where he hadn't lived since he was 11. That's huge, because the right governor read it. The decision was made. We assume there was cause and effect there because of the timing. A project like this probably has less direct, clear impacts, like in the following weeks. But I wonder if you could get it in front of one person, who would you want to read your book, and what change in a perfect world or in your ideal situation would you hope the book would make?
Yeah, I mean, one person's hard. I'm going to answer this two ways. The first would be, I really wrote this book with a reader in mind who it feels like frightened and freaked out by climate change, but isn't quite sure about how to deal with that, right? Like it's too much, it's too abstract, it's too inaccessible, it's too numerical. And what I hoped is that these, like, here's a whole bunch of stories that break this down on the level of narrative and just make it a bit easier to come at these issues and get rid of some of that, climate silence or climate paralysis, or just feeling like unable to make moves on these issues. And then, I don't know, I think part of me wants to say like world leaders, but I think that, part of what we're seeing at COP and other events is that, it's a lot of pomp and circumstance. It's really difficult to get a lot in the way of measurable action out of this. I have a lot more faith, frankly, in the incredible, climate activists, people who are working around the world to demand that these conversations become not just something we talk about 1 week or 2 weeks a year, but something that is constantly on the agenda. And so for that kind of a reader, this book, I would hope serves as a reminder that stories are really powerful and that narrative is one of many tools we should be using, in conversation, in dialogue with climate science, but to bring more people in to connect at a deeply human to human level and to bring more empathy into the conversation, because that's a super powerful tool that we have at our disposal.
Definitely. And I think this book definitely proved that. So let me check the chat for some questions. Let's see. Okay, I don't see any, but I don't know if I know how to see them.
There's a little part at the bottom that says ask a question, and there's
okay, there's 3 there.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So you could really answer these yourselves. I'm going to ask them out loud.
No, go for it. Yeah.
How do you decompress if and when you feel overwhelmed by climate change problems?
Okay. Decompression and overwhelm are like maybe 2 different things, but I think part of my instinct when I feel overwhelmed by something is to try to break it down into its component parts. So while I know that I cannot tackle climate change as an individual, I can go and have an interview with someone who's doing something incredible in their community, or I can talk with people about this book, right? That makes me feel like I'm doing something. And I think that the more conversations that we can be having about these issues, the better off we'll all be. Because if we're all just like super frightened and ignoring it, then that becomes difficult to kind of do anything with. And then, I don't know, I'm just super moved by the work of incredible folks working around the world like Vanessa Nakate, right? And just who are at the UN Climate Summit right now, delivering speeches to rooms full of world leaders and taking time to like absorb and amplify their work as well, is a thing that for me, I find to be really recharging.
I'm going to answer for you as well, because I know that you just accomplished a goal of climbing. Correct me if I get it wrong. Is it like the 48 peaks over a certain number of meters?
4,000 feet. Yeah.
So you set a goal to climb all 48 of them.
Yeah.
You did it largely during the pandemic. Is sort of setting measurable goals and achieving them a way that you manage anxiety of all this or everything else in life?
Yes, 100%. I mean, part of the reason why I went on all those hikes is because I needed a break from writing, which is funny now because I'm very motivated by patches because I was a Girl Scout. And in order to get the patch for the 48, I have to write an essay for the Appalachian Mountain Club. And I'm like, I was doing this to get away from writing. Like, it's painfully ironic, but kind of funny. And I'm going to do it at some point. But yeah, I think that, having a writing goal, moving concurrently with a goal that had nothing to do with writing was really good for me. And even frankly, not being able to go anywhere during the pandemic and feeling like really unable to do the things that I wanted to do, focusing wholly on writing this gave me a small measurable thing to do bit by bit. I'm also doing National Novel Writing Month this month because apparently I'm a masochist, but it's
is it a novel?
Super fun community. Yeah, it's I can't say a ton about it because it's like a hot mess, but it's vaguely climate adjacent. It's coming together. We'll see what happens. But yeah, it's a community of people all around the world who get together to write 50,000 words of a draft on a novel in 1 month in November each year. And it's been a lot of fun to try it. So yeah, I feel a little adrift when I don't have a goal like that. I don't know what that says about my personality, but it's like a tiny way of having a little bit of control over chaos.
I had a feeling that might be part of it.
Yeah.
Someone else, Lizzie, asked, what was the most memorable part of this experience?
Oh my God, so many parts. There was one, I'll give one like story answer and then one personal answer. So there was one day on the bicycle in New Zealand where I was going up and over Arthur's Pass, which is kind of, it's like a mountain pass in the South Island. And it's one of the steepest roads in the whole country. And I camped out the night before. I was mostly out of food and then ran out of food around midday and pulled over to a gas station that was on the side of the road. It's like a relentless uphill, right? And go into the gas station and I'm feeling like a little out of it. The only thing that looks remotely appetizing were these pack of gummies, but they weren't gummy bears or gummy worms. They were gummy vampire teeth. And so I get back out to my bike and I'm like sitting on the ground next to it, just like pounding this bag of vampire teeth. And these two gas station attendants come over to me and they're like, you know, if you get tired, you can roll back down and we'll drive you to the top in our truck. They call it a ute there, in our ute. And I'm like, that was what I needed. Like I needed someone to tell me I couldn't do it, to bend me to do it. So I'm like, all right, I'm gonna do it. So like fueled on this like ridiculous sugar high. I'm like cycling up this hill. There's people rolling down their windows to cheer me on. And I felt so elated when I got to the top. Right? I mean, it was gorgeous. There's like, you know, sweeping mountain vistas and like a viaduct or something, like a waterfall, some parrots, I don't know. And I got to the top and I was so elated to have done it that I kind of like pushed my bike down, picked a flower, put it behind my ear and just like did this happy dance. And I don't know, it just kind of reminded me that like, do hard things, like joy is anywhere. If I take the time to, it became a little bit of a ritual. It was like, if there was a hill that I didn't think I would get up, then I would stop and do a happy dance at the top. I did a flower behind my ear that was from.
I thought you were going to say you would eat gummy bears.
And yeah, I love gummy bears. Like shamelessly. Or Sour Patch Kids are great. But anyway, I digress. So that was one memorable, just kind of like overcoming myself moment or an obstacle. There was this other story that I mean a whole bunch of the stories were really sticky. Like I felt like I couldn't stop thinking about them for miles and miles after. But one of them was in Kazakhstan. I met this guy at a conference that I was attending there as a speaker. His name was Ashan. He waited until the last day of the conference, like when people were packing up the chairs and tables to come over, and he was like shaking. And he said, I want to tell you a story. And I had a translator with me at that time. And I'm like, do you want to, you know, we can speak through her. And he's like, no, I want to tell you in the best English that I can, because I want you to really understand. I was like, okay. And he told me that he had grown up in Afghanistan, that the village where he lived didn't have running water, and that there was a river that kind of ran through town, but it was pretty heavily polluted. And in order to have that water be safe for consumption at home, his family would boil it. And there was one day where he was in charge of looking after his younger brother, who's a couple years younger than him. And his parents were out of the house, and somehow his brother got like tangled up around the fire, and this whole bucket of boiling water came down on him, and his brother died from those injuries. And it was just like so sad, right? And this had really clearly affected him. He told me that he felt responsible for his death, and that he's decided to become a water engineer because he doesn't want any other kid in Central Asia to have to deal with that same lack of access to safe water that took his brother's life.
That's so interesting, because most people wouldn't think of that as a climate change related death.
Right. Yeah. And it's not quite
clearly
a climate story, right? But I see the issues as intertwined, because getting people access to safe water is something that can be, you know, exacerbated by climate change. And I think it was one of those, it felt too important to not include as well. To me, it felt related, but.
Going back to biking up that hill, I know you were always a cyclist, but did you train for this journey at all physically?
Oh, hell no. I mean, okay, so I was on the rowing team in college. I was like a recruited athlete. Like I was vaguely sporty going into this, but I also had torn my ACL summer after sophomore year, playing pickup soccer with friends. It was the like most unglamorous injury. And biking was one of the first things that I could do to get my heart rate up after that. Like first I was using a hand bike in the PT office, and then I could get back on a real bicycle. And for a while I could bike more than I could walk. And so it was my main way of getting around. And the bicycle went from being a tool that I just used to get from place to place in the Boston area to being like actively the tool of my liberation. And I got kind of obsessed with it. And you're so right that like a goal is a theme, but I needed a goal. I felt really adrift. And, you know, so much of how I defined myself had been around rowing. At that point, I couldn't do it anymore for a while until I got better. But I could ride my bike. And so I was like, okay, by this time next summer, I'll be able to ride my bike a really long distance. And then I was like up late over winter break, my grandmother's basement, like Googling different bike paths in the US. And the Mississippi River has a bike trail that goes from Lake Itasca all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. It's like, that sounds fun. I'm not gonna have time to do all of this because I have a summer job and need to save up to buy a bike, but like, why not? So that became the goal that like propelled me through the really hard time of being injured. So yeah, I don't know. I think the best way to train for doing a bike trip is to do a bike trip. Like figured out a lot on the way. I did not even know how to change a flat when I got started. Really? All of the bicycle maintenance skills I have learned have been something went catastrophically wrong, and then I had to improvise to figure it out. But I don't know. It's been a fun way to learn.
I can't remember if you talked about this in the book, but how did your family feel about you going and the risks that you were taking just to your physical safety?
Outwardly, they were really supportive. Inwardly, I learned later that my mom was freaking out, but I think that's like a normal mom thing to do.
Yeah.
Backstory on my family is that I was raised by mountaineers, and my mom was a single mom for a bit, but also during that time when I was like 3 and up, maybe like until I was 7, she was a professional high altitude mountaineer in the Himalayas. She was climbing on Everest and K2 and Gasherim 2 and Kanchenjunga, all of that without oxygen. She was leading expeditions that were sponsored by National Geographic. She was like a big deal. And I hated it when I was a kid. It was my least favorite thing in the world. I felt like I was being left behind, right? But the flip side of that, and I since have come around to a whole load of gratitude that she went on these incredible adventures, because it gave me a model of what that looks like as a woman. And it just felt to me like the least big deal. I'm like, well, I'm not going to have to dig myself out of an avalanche. Like, I'm not ice climbing. What I'm doing is so tame in comparison. So yeah, I just, you know, did my due diligence of checking in to let them know I was alive as much as I could. And
it wasn't even that much. It seems like it was like every once in a while you would be able to find a way of letting your family know you were alive.
I mean, honestly, I posted a lot on, I feel weird saying this now because like Facebook is Facebook, but I posted a lot on Facebook, which interestingly, some of the, and I wrote on a blog, and like those posts became like notes that I could revisit and try and remember different things. So that was useful.
Oh, that's interesting, because I was going to ask you earlier how you remembered so many details about your day-to-day life and the conversations you had with people, because you're recording your interviews, but you weren't recording your home life, and just the time you were spending with people you stayed with and the conversations you had over dinner. So were you filling those notebooks and sending them home, and then also doing your blog?
Yeah, exactly. It was a combination of those two. And then I just had pages and pages of notes that I would type into like that Word document too, that then revisited. But it was a large part. I mean, those notebooks were really useful. They were like almost falling apart in some cases, but the World Postal Service did get them back to where they needed to go. So yeah, it worked out.
Oh, we have one more audience question from Susan. What is your advice for respectfully listening to someone who you strongly disagree with?
Oh my God. Such a good one.
Do this a few times.
Yeah. I feel like this is like a Dear Prudie question. I'm curious. I want you to answer this too, because I'm super curious.
Okay.
What you would say. But for me, okay. I think that values-based communication can be a really strong way of having a conversation about something like climate change with someone who's maybe on the opposite end of the spectrum. And I'm assuming that maybe there's other contentious issues that this could work with too. But it's first about, not coming on super strong with like, I'm right and you're wrong and this is why, or here's a fact and I'm going to drop you with some information that then you are going to respond to in a purely logical way. Because humans don't work like that. We're really emotional and weird. So it's about establishing a common ground. And moving the conversation forward from there. So that could be that you and I have a shared value that's family, right? Or something else. And then it becomes easier to connect, even if we're coming at the issue of climate change from a different way, because I can talk about the ways that climate change is impacting the future for like kids, or impacts how I think about having a family or whatever, right? But I realize that you asked more about listening than about speaking. So this is more about talking to someone. But in terms of listening, I don't know. It's sometimes like shutting up and nodding. It's asking questions, coming at it from a vantage point of curiosity and being like, why? What is the reason why you have this point of view? And trying to understand it and then respond, but putting the brakes on the response that might be super negative and then moving forward from there. I feel like I rambled a bit, but I'm curious what you would say.
I guess I would say first, like, decide what your goal is.
Yeah.
So is your goal to educate them or change their mind, or is your goal just to survive the bus ride or whatever it is where you're stuck next to them? So if your goal is just to like be done with them and get out of the situation, like nod and smile, change the subject, put your headphones in, whatever. But I guess Sue actually did ask about actually listening. I agree that asking questions is probably the most effective. Why did you think that? Where did you learn that? Could you send me something that would further explain that? Where did you find that information? I think are great questions to sort of get people seeing sometimes the weaknesses in their own arguments without it becoming contentious. And you're actually telling them, like, they may end up telling themselves if they don't have answers to your questions.
Yeah. Oh, that's really well said.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to say today?
Journalist question. I love this one. I don't know. I think one thing that I hoped became clear, and I only realized that I didn't put in like a sentence in the book until afterwards, but like trying to just diversify the way that we think about expertise, right? That there's traditional experts in the sense of like a talking head on TV or someone who has a PhD in atmospheric sciences. And those, types of expertise are really important and often are the things that we turn to when we're trying to understand a subject. But especially with something as complex as climate change, the conversation will be richer and more valuable to all of us if we put those forms of expertise in dialogue with the equally valid forms of expertise of people who just have lived experience, because lived experience is a form of expertise in its own right. And so by going to and listening to people who are already impacted by climate change, we can understand more about the issue and make better decisions about how to move forward. I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for this conversation. And I think I speak for everyone when I say I think you have just a brilliant mind and obviously so much energy, and we should all feel really lucky that you've chosen to dedicate it to this cause that affects all of us on Earth so much. So thank you. Thank you so much, Jenée. I loved chatting with you, always pure joy. And thanks to everyone for being here. It's really fun.
And buy the book if you haven't already.
Yeah, you can buy the book via the teal button at the bottom center. And thank you so much, Devi and Jenée. This was a really, really incredible conversation. And I agree with Devi's mom that, Jenée, you asked incredible questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Devi's mom. I know you asked.
Thank you all. You have a really great night. Hope to see you again. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.